The role of the journalist is vital for a democracy.
The Delta Democrat Times was really one of the great papers in Mississippi during a particularly tough period. Hodding went on to become Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs during the Jimmy Carter administration, and in that capacity was basically this country's spokesman in matters dealing with foreign policy. After that, he became a lecturer, television commentator. He ran the Knight Foundation, and now he's a professor of public policy at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I just wanted to say we all had dinner last night at Holly Rainey's. Holly, glad to have you here. Holly grew up with Hodding in Greenville and with Chancellor Jones, and the three of us here were all worked for newspapers in the Delta back in the 1960s, 1970s. And when we were young men, this state had a reputation of being the closed society. It was the title of a book written by a history professor here at Ole Miss named Jim Silver, and it referred to the official and unofficial policies that basically suppressed any kind of dissent in this state, any talk that opposed segregation, even in a place where free speech should flourish, the University of Mississippi, these policies applied. We had something we were reminded last night called the speaker's ban at Ole Miss, and no dangerous subversive speakers were allowed on campus, and one of those who wasn't allowed on campus was Hodding Carter, and so we're glad that Hodding is back. But we noted last night that the old closed society has basically been shattered, and I think there are great examples here on this campus that we now have not only a monument to James Meredith, but a memorial to the civil rights movement. Will Campbell, who was a chaplain here at Ole Miss in the 1950s and was banished because he dared play ping pong with a black man, has returned to this campus, has been honored, and I noticed Will's going to be back in Oxford later this month to speak at the Methodist Church here. And then lo and behold, Dr. Silver, who wrote about the closed society, I don't know whether you've noticed, but there is a new lake on campus, a little pond right off of Sorority Row, and it's going to be named Silver Pond, and there's going to be a memorial to Dr. Silver on this campus. And here we have Hodding Carter back. It's not his first time back, but we're always glad to have him on campus, and I think it's a reflection of all the changes that have taken place. Hodding will be talking today with Bill Rose, who is also a native of the Delta, and his first real newspaper job was with the Delta Democrat Times when Hodding was presiding over that newspaper. Bill went on to a distinguished career at the Miami Herald, and we're happy to have him on the journalism faculty.
My father, like my mother, was a native of Louisiana. My dad was from Hammond, Louisiana. My mother was from New Orleans. And he had started a paper right after the Depression forced the closing of the banks in 1933. He started a newspaper in Hammond, Louisiana, a little tabloid daily. Incredible in that town, and tabloid was really in every way what it was, which seemed to have only one purpose when he was running it, which was to destroy the political power of Huey Long, who was the second most powerful political figure in America. Who do you think got destroyed first? In any case, Dad was at LSU one time, and he ran into an old friend named David Cohn, one of Greenville's multiple famous writers, authors, newspaper people, and the like. And Dave Cohn said, "What the devil are you doing breaking your head against the wall down there in Hammond fighting Long? You're going to lose." He said, but Will Percy and some others are looking for a real newspaper up in Greenville. The one we got is a little boring. It doesn't really cover the town. It just takes in the ads and prints the paper, or so the story goes anyway. And Dad went over to meet Will Percy, who he thought a good bit of, and came back and said, we're going to Greenville. That is not something I remember, because I had just been born a few months before. We came to Greenville in '36. 2 years after that, put the other paper out of business because, in fact, we were printing a newspaper of record, at least of sorts, and they weren't, and became the monopoly paper in Greenville. Answer number one to how it was we survived is that we were the monopoly daily newspaper in Greenville. There wasn't much alternative for certain kinds of things, though you could have started another paper against us. Point two, Dad really was a community newspaper guy. Whatever his editorial positions might have been, and believe me, they evolved. None of us sprung full-blown out of some brow immediately as whatever people think we were. The first order of business, as he saw it, was to really cover and promote the community in which he lived, which he did with great vigor. In the 1930s, after our arrival, in fact, he went off and worked for the Cotton Council for a little while, helping promote Delta cotton or something, I mean, somewhere in that period. He did disturb the even tenor of the days there a little bit because, let me just be blunt about it, the only time the story about or picture of a black man or woman would appear in the in any Southern newspaper was at a lynching or at some unfortunate criminal situation. And I say it bluntly because that's the way it was. Dad ran the picture of the great Jesse Owens, who won at the '36 Olympics. He ran it on the front page. And a lot of people went semi-berserk about that breaking of the color line by this guy who had just broken the proud boast of the Nazi and Hitler in particular at the Berlin Olympics, that there was such a thing as inferior people, which the master race could beat at anything. And a few other things like that occurred. But he goes off to war because the Greenville, Mississippi National Guard was activated, just for everybody's memory, 13 months before Pearl Harbor. That is to say, in November of 1940. And Dad had written an editorial right after Munich saying, this means World War II. This capitulation to Hitler about Czechoslovakia means World War II. The local National Guard commander came up to him and said, Hodding, brilliant editorial, the National Guard is always first to go. Daddy got that message and he became the oldest private in the Mississippi National Guard. Shortly thereafter was called up and off we went to live, in my instance, he was overseas for part of it, in Maryland. Daddy comes back. His mustering out, he's lost half an eye in the course of the wartime. And he looks around and he's reading and hearing about speeches by Theodore Bilbo and Jim Eastland on race and a few other things. And in one white-hot period of fury at the end of '45, the war having just ended, he writes a series of editorials attacking this kind of what he felt to be utterly unacceptable bigotry. My father was never actually an integrationist, let us be clear, but he was opposed to any number of things which interfered with folks otherwise, but most particularly, he opposed both the language and the repressive style. His partner, unknown to him, sent off 12 of those editorials to the Pulitzer Committee, and to the surprise of all and sundry, not least Hodding Carter, Jr., he wins the Pulitzer Prize for writing in 1945, gets it in '46. He is now the official enemy of a number of white Mississippians. He has become identified as a person who attacks segregationist spokesmen. He's won a prize which was called by, starting with Theodore Bilbo, that Jew prize, the Pulitzer. And it was interesting. Nonetheless, he's writing a series of books. He ended up writing 22, which were as much a defense of the South as they were an attack on some of its institutions. It was always a mixed thing he was presenting. His editorial policy was usually very heavily backing community. But when mad, he was not moderate. He was intensely focused with rage and would write things which would take the bark off any tree about anybody at whatever level of power, and most particularly those who preened most vigorously as the last defenders of white supremacy. But even that would have been okay. Not okay, but we were running a newspaper that community thought was theirs. The Supreme Court desegregation decision comes down in 1954. Dad had opposed the idea of the court doing it. At that time, in fact, I had a friend of the brief friend of the court opposing it. But within the week of it being enunciated, said, okay, hold on to your shirts. It's the right thing morally. It's the right thing democratically. We are going to live with this thing and make it work. And that was not actually what white Mississippians were saying at the time. But more particularly, the Citizens Council gets organized a few months later over in Indianola. Dad begins to hear about secret meetings of leadership types who seem to be what? They won't tell him. They won't tell anybody. And they're spreading like wildfire. He writes a couple of magazine articles, one of which in Look magazine says, "A new wave of terror threatens the South." By that time, several black guys had been killed in the Delta and in South Mississippi for trying to vote. The repression doubled up. And the legislature passes a resolution calling him a liar by something like 107 to 29 or something. So he writes a front page editorial saying that 100 and something are liars. They can go to hell, and they can wait for him there in hell until he backs down, and he will not be backing down, so they can count on a long visit. And we were at war. We were at war from 1955 until about 1970 with the Citizens Council, with the political majority in the state, and it became what can loosely be called the most famous kiss of death in American political endorsements. Brave men wept when they heard that we'd endorsed them for public office because we were literally the kiss of death. How did we play in those days? From the time he was opposing Huey Long, who was not above using his state police to steal ballot boxes and to come in with machine guns to surround balloting places that he didn't want to have a fair vote. Dad had been essentially a one-man arsenal from 1933 on. I grew up in a house in which there was a gun in virtually every room, a gun in the desk at the office, and in the car. It was commonplace. And when the idiots would call at night, Dad would cuss into the phone. He'd get a .45 and a shotgun. He'd go out into the car, park. He'd sit there and wait for them. And they never came, which was always a surprise to him and a relief to all of us who were sure this time death was going to come.